Hello and welcome to Strategic News International. I'm Ashwin Ahmad and I'm in conversation with my colleague Amitabh Revi. And today we're going to be talking about the fall of ISIS. Amitabh, let me turn to you. Now the first thing is, after the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, do you think this is the end of ISIS? Do you think his death was rather symbolic? How do you see the situation panning out?
When you look at the operation, it was a very successful operation that the US conducted. But strategically, whether ISIS is actually dead, Daesh is dead, is absolutely not clear. And in fact, it's just the opposite. Baghdadi was probably the most important person killed since Osama bin Laden in 2011.
Right.
Maybe even more important considering what Daesh has done in the last 5 years or so. But again, like I'm saying, it was a very successful operation, a difficult operation, a risky operation in terms of the areas that the helicopters carrying the American Special Forces had to fly over. About an hour and 10 minutes, I think President Donald Trump mentioned it was.
Sure.
But ISIS, like Donald Trump said, is dead is completely not true, especially in looking at the conditions that are again erupting when you look at Iraq itself, apart from the whole area.
When the US forces moved away from Iraq in 2011, we saw the emergence of ISIS. Do you see a similar situation panning out with the US now withdrawing largely from Syria, except in around the oil fields?
Like you're pointing out, when they pulled out, that was the precursor to Daesh, or the Islamic State was, of course, the Islamic State in Iraq, and before that it was affiliated to Al-Qaeda. But that was one of the major conditions that fulfilled the rise of Daesh in Iraq and then spreading across both Syria and Iraq. So the conditions are there again in many different ways, because that's one of the reasons why Daesh rose. But then there are also other conditions that are the discrimination of Sunnis by Shia-led governments, how people are having a lot of problem in terms of just their daily lives. So those conditions are also rising as well, which could fuel, if not the structure of Daesh to be intact, at least for terror groups to continue to operate in that area.
I also want to point out now, ISIS is not going to let the Baghdadi's death go, if I may use the word, unpunished. There's a chance of maybe some kind of attacks. Do you see signature lone wolf attacks emerging across maybe Europe, etc.?
Which were already there even while Baghdadi was alive, and that was one of the ideologies that was being spread by Daesh, for lone wolves to attack, not necessarily for Daesh. France, we saw a different thing, where the operatives that went out into France. But American officials have gone on record to say that they are preparing for some kind of retaliation.
Right.
So that's something that they all have to be aware of. There will be possibly some kind of a reaction to Baghdadi's death, because he killed himself in the end. So even if the Americans say he wasn't a martyr, and President Trump says he died like a dog, which is a turn of phrase which he shouldn't have used, especially because Conan, the canine, was a part of that whole operation. President Trump has also gone on to talk about Conan, saying that even though he's recovering, apparently in the tunnel which collapsed after Baghdadi exploded his suicide vest with his 2 small children in there, the tunnel collapsed, and the dog apparently came into contact with some live electrical wires. So he was injured, but he's recovering. I presume it's a he from the photograph. But President Trump has also said that Conan will be going to the White House next week, so you can expect some more photo ops coming out from the White House next week on that front.
You know, ISIS may be just gaining ground now, but it's symbolic in the sense it's kind of a brand name for terrorist groups all over the world. So there are 2 questions here. How do you see it affecting terror groups elsewhere? Do you see them rejuvenating? Also, in terms of foreign fighters, I mean, India has very few foreign fighters so far, I think around 200, joining ISIS. But do you see ISIS as posing any kind of threat to India through other terror groups?
So the first part of your question, when you're talking about terror groups in the area and Daesh or Islamic State itself.
Right.
Now, the Caliph is dead. There is no caliphate in terms of the territory it held, but the cause is not. The cause is very much alive. Experts are pointing out that the competitive jihadism between Al-Qaeda and Daesh could prompt some kind of a merger, or at least that's what Al-Qaeda would want.
Right.
Whether Daesh holds on to its structure, there are also a lot of movement, chatter on encrypted social media sites that Daesh uses, which seems to suggest, one, that very soon they're going to accept his death, obviously eulogize him like they would for anybody else, and possibly even name a successor. You have to also see what's happened straight after Baghdadi died. The Americans, again, in another operation, which ironically the Kurds have played a crucial role in intelligence and on-the-ground information for both these strikes. Somebody called Al-Muhajir, which is a nom-de-guerre, of course, who was the spokesperson of Daesh, was also apparently killed in another strike, and he was possibly one successor. Experts are pointing to somebody who is known as Moli, I think. He also has different names. He's known as, I think, Abdullah as well, and he has two, three other names. He's already on the US Treasury Department's Rewards for Justice program. He has a $5 million bounty on his head for any information that leads to his arrest or his killing. He's lower down in the tier in terms of the hierarchy. You see, Baghdadi himself had a $25 million bounty on his head.
Yes.
In the official page, website of the US Treasury Department's Rewards for Justice, it clearly mentions that this person, who calls himself a religious scholar, is one possible successor.
Okay.
So now, if ISIS names him, they're going to try and keep that structure alive, and the Daesh supporters are already online saying that the cause doesn't die with one man.
Right.
That's an ideology which we've seen all through this group and other terror groups as well. Before him, there was Zarqawi as well, before Baghdadi. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in this competitive jihad space between Al-Qaeda and Daesh. But the structure itself, I'm sure they'll try to keep that going. Even if they don't have a caliph, they don't have a caliphate. Like I said, the cause is still there.
And what about India?
That was the second part of your question. Now, it'll be interesting to see the latest Government of India figures. You're saying about 200, or there are various reports of Indians, mostly from the south, from Kerala, but also from Uttar Pradesh and other areas, Bihar, going to Afghanistan, going to Syria, going via Turkey or Iran. There's no clear figure on how many they are. But if my memory serves me correct, I think in Ministry of Home, a written answer in Parliament, possibly in June, I think, this year. They were talking, of course, not about the people who had left, but the people who had been arrested in India. Was roughly about 155 ISIS sympathizers have been arrested in India. So comparatively, that number is not that large. Per capita, definitely not. But I'm sure intelligence agencies are keeping a close tab on that. You look at the Maldives per capita, at one point of time, they supposedly had the most number of people who had traveled abroad to join Daesh and other groups. But the other thing about Daesh or Islamic State is that it's not anymore ISIS or ISIL. It's not confined only to Syria or the Levant and Iraq. Right. It has its subsidiaries all over, from Africa, to the African continent, to South Asia as well. We saw what happened in Sri Lanka. Right. So they may not be, that's the other thing about terrorist organizations, they are very decentralized. They operate almost on a franchise basis. So people who pick up their ideology may not be getting direct orders from the top, but ultimately even the Easter bombings were claimed by
they have localized, yeah. So now let's come to the larger picture. I mean, Turkey has invaded Syria. There's been a meeting and some kind of agreement with Russia. Do you see Turkey as playing an active role in perhaps containing the ISIS with Russian pressure? How do you see that situation panning out?
Well, there are many who say that Turkey facilitated the foreign fighters joining the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria. The Turks at the present are very clear about what they're trying to do. They don't want this idea of an autonomous Kurdistan to grow larger. And they've connected the Kurds in Iraq and in Syria, and they are all over that area, to the PKK, which is a terrorist organization in Turkey, and even the US recognizes that as a terrorist organization. So the Turks, fight against Islamic State, I'm not so sure that's not their primary objective, even though they say that in the areas that they control, if there are prisons which have Daesh fighters or their family, they will take control of that. But the biggest gainer in this whole situation with the Turks invading Syria are the Russians.
Okay.
The Russians, and of course the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad himself, that was one area which his forces had not entered since 2011. But now they're at the border. The Russian troops are also there. They call them military police, of course. But whether Russia, with its current budgetary problems, financial problems, will be able to sustain this kind of military presence for very long, I'm not sure. But certainly at the moment, apart from Turkey getting what it wants through force, the Russians and to a large extent the Iranians are gaining the most from the US withdrawal and what's happened subsequently.
I'm glad you brought up Bashar. What happens to him now in the geopolitics between these three countries?
Like I said, he's one of the other big winners here. There was a time when I think his forces didn't control even around 25% of the whole territory of Syria.
Right.
After the Russians came in with their air force, they had Navy vessels also in Latakia as well, and the Iranians, whether it's Hezbollah or other militias or the IRGC itself, he's regained 75% of his forces have regained 75% of the territory. And now they have that swath of land as well, which they had never entered before.
Right.
So he's completely on the upper hand. So if the US, whether they said it or not, wanted any regime change, that's not happening anyway soon, unless it happens internally through Syrian opposition or rebels or dissidents within the military or something like that. His hand is also much stronger now.
And how does that affect the rest of West Asia? Saudi Arabia, the Gulf region, etc.
Those dynamics are also playing out in so many different ways, the Saudis versus Iran, what's happening in Yemen as well. The latest we've heard is that the UAE have withdrawn from Aden and given it over to the Saudi forces. So it's a complete conundrum in that area, anyway was, and it's even getting more complicated as we go on, looking at the strategies and the policies that are being followed by various powers.
And finally, how do you think, India has had a very balanced, nuanced policy towards West Asia, but do you think with these changing dynamics that can hold, what kind of strategies, if one can say, do you think the Indian government will take moving forward?
I think they're going to continue on the path that they are currently doing, which is you're not an ally of anybody, but you are friends and you gain from people who are enemies within themselves, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Israel. We have ties, business ties. We have a diaspora there, which is giving us huge remittances. There's business. We've seen the Prime Minister's visit to Saudi Arabia. So I would presume that they would continue down the same path, which is engage with everybody in spite of two players being enemies amongst themselves.
Thank you for your thoughts, Amitabh, and thank you for watching SNI.